disconnect at this time. I will now turn the presentation over to your presenter. You may begin.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's Chris Valentino of Jackson Lewis. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. As most of you know on the phone, Jackson Lewis does a lot of handbook reviews for employers. I personally do a lot of them for the Long Island employers that I work with. And despite the fact that we have been talking about handbook hiccups for the longest time, not only do we have employers who are continuing to make the same drafting mistakes, but we also have a labor board that is moving the target on us. And what I wanted to do this afternoon was provide just some different examples of cases that the labor board has issued over the last couple of months. Everything is fairly recent. And give you sort of an insight into the way that I see these cases, I interpret them, and give you an ability to audit specific policies within your handbook to see whether or not we have violations that exist. We're going to talk about specific policies today. We're going to talk about solicitation distribution, confidentiality. We'll talk about codes of conduct policy. Most important, though, is the ability to see the analysis on a micro level and apply it on a macro level. And what I want to do is I want to help you do that today. First and foremost, let's focus on what our National Labor Relations Board is saying about handbook policies. On the top, I have rules, policies, and PCA, PCA being protected concerted activity. Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act. General Counsel Griffin said last year, most employers do not draft their employee handbooks with the object of prohibiting or restricting conduct protected by the National Labor Relations Act, period. The Labor Board doesn't believe that employers are trying to impede the National Labor Relations Act. Continue. But even well-intentioned rules that would inhibit an employee from engaging in activities protected by the Act are not allowed. So even when your well-intentioned policies have or possibly step on the toes of Section 7, this Labor Board is going to find a National Labor Relations Board violation, right? And this approach to interpreting your policies comes from a case. The case is Lutheran Heritage, and basically the holding of Lutheran Heritage was, and you look at that second bullet, even if a rule does not explicitly prohibit activity, it still will be found unlawful if, number one, and I underline this one because I want you to focus on the breadth of examination that the Labor Board is utilizing. Employees would reasonably construe the rules language to prohibit Section 7 activity. Basically, what your Labor Board has done has turned that into a very, very open-ended analysis. When looking at your handbook policies, if it is possible that an employee could interpret this policy as stepping on the toes of their Section 7 rights, it will be found to have violated the National Labor Relations Act. That's how broad this standard has become over the last 3 years, right? In the case, Lutheran Heritage, the mere maintenance of a work rule may violate the NLRA if the rule has a chilling effect on employees' Section 7 rights. We have expanded this from a mathematical formula to a fishing expedition when it comes to your handbook policy. If your handbook policy hasn't been reviewed and you are not looking at it from the perspective of the Labor Board, especially when it comes to policies that we're going to talk about, all right, it's time to do it, because I do not want to see you fall prey to an unfair labor practice charge. It also makes sense for me to remind you the Labor Board, the National Labor Relations Act specifically regards Section 7 applies to all employers. It doesn't apply just to those that have union-represented employees. It applies to everybody, all right? So the messages from today's webinar apply to everybody as well. First case, Dish Network, issued in March. dealing with non-solicitation policies. Employer's policy, and you can read on the slide, and they'll be available on the SHRM Long Island website, all right? But employer's policy focused on solicitation says that in the interest of maintaining a proper business environment and preventing interference with work and inconvenience to others, employees may not distribute literature of a personal nature by any means, here we go, or solicit for any other reason during work time or in work areas, except as specifically authorized in advance by the Vice President, ... Just such a narrow violation here resulted in a finding against the employer because solicitation distribution policies cannot preclude employees from engaging in solicitation when they are on non-work time. This policy did that. It was too broad because the language that I've italicized talked about soliciting for any reason during work time, that was okay, or in work areas. Well, what about the employee who is not on work time but is in a work area? This policy precludes that person from engaging in solicitation activity. That preclusion is a violation of the National Labor Relations Act. Alcoa case from November of 2015, just to sort of contrast and compare, was found to be lawful. This focused on distribution. If you looked at the policy, the distribution policy in this case, you saw that it mirrored what the Labor Board allows in terms of prohibitions on distribution, saying you cannot distribute anything in our workplace in any work area or while the distributor or the distributee is on work time. Labor Board found this to be lawful. Go back and look at your solicitation distribution policies. Make sure your prohibitions mirror what is permissible by the National Labor Relations Board. All right? Codes of conduct policy. You all have them. You all have them. They were probably written 10 years ago, and they include so much fluff language about anything that disturbs the workplace. I love the ones that say anything that paints the employer in a bad light. All of that broad fluff language is a field day for our National Labor Relations Board. All right? Look at this policy. Employer's policy, conduct on the part of an employee that impedes harmonious interactions and relationships will not be tolerated. If you have that language, it's time to get out the pen. We've got to cross it out. Other things included in the policy, verbal comments or physical gestures directed at others that exceed the bounds of fair criticism, negative or disparaging comments about moral character or professional capabilities, behavior that is counter to promoting teamwork. All of this stuff is stuff, it's great, we love it. It should be, that's the way that a workplace should run. But could an employee see this as stepping on the toes of their Section 7 rights? Could somebody say, well, you know, in that last bullet, behavior that is counter to promoting teamwork. So does that mean that if I go around and I say, I don't believe the employer is taking care of us, I think we should join a union, and trying to rally coworkers by engaging in lawful communication, is that behavior that would counter promoting teamwork? The Labor Board would say it would, and in this case, in fact, did. Is the above language so ambiguous that the employee reasonably may interpret it as prohibiting Section 7 activity? Hands down. Case issued April 2016, Labor Board says, yes, 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 yes. In all of these situations, way too broad. What are you trying to say, employer? You can't use this 30,000-foot language. Drill down. When you're crafting these types of policies, be as specific as possible. If impeding teamwork really means communicating in a physically threatening or intimidating manner, say that. If you don't want people acting unprofessionally, say it. Don't leave that glossy, flowy language, the vague language, and I've included some examples. Uncomfortable, disruptive, workplace harmony, all that should be avoided. All right. What I did was I also pulled language out of other decisions that the Labor Board found to be unlawful. Read through this. Don't make fun or denigrate or defame your coworkers. All right, that was found to be overbroad. No defamatory, libelous, slanderous, or discriminatory comments. Defamatory in and of itself, too broad. Don't make statements that damage the company's reputation. Too broad. Policies barring negative comments. Don't gossip in the workplace. All right, and require employees to act in a professional or positive manner. Positive, what does that mean? Does that mean positive? You're focused on supporting the company? If you are talking about joining a union, is that anti-company? Is that negative? Is that a violation of your policy? We can no longer leave this language to chance. Confidentiality policies in the Victory 2 case issued just a week ago, right? Employer has a policy in its handbook, and again, if you've heard me speak, you know that I like to pull our confidentiality provisions out, have standalone agreements now, because confidentiality of employers' sensitive data is way too big an issue to be leaving to a handbook policy. But Victory didn't hear any of my speeches, and they had this handbook policy that included confidentiality of proprietary information. But in that definition of confidentiality, what did they include? They included stuff that employees have a right to talk about, such as compensation data, personnel information, bonus information. This is a no-brainer, right? In this case, the Labor Board is saying, look, did you overstep your bounds in precluding employees under your confidentiality provisions from talking about stuff that they have a right to talk about? And the answer was hands down, yes, despite the fact that the employer included in the mix of its definition things that really were proprietary. It incorporated things that really weren't confidential, i.e. employee compensation and bonus information, and that crushed the employer's defense in this case and ultimately resulted in a finding against it by the Labor Board. All right, so remember, when you're looking at your confidentiality provisions, look at them and be careful and be detailed and focus on it. Don't just go on to Google and say, what is confidential? Copy and paste that definition into your policy. That's the wrong way to do it. The right way to do it is to know your business, sit down with those people, the managers, supervisors, and say, what do you deem as confidential? And tailor that definition for your business. That's the right way to do it, and the extra care that you put into defining confidential information for your business will pay off in the long run. Another example, alternative entertainment. I pulled this case from February, basically said the same thing. Definition of confidentiality in a handbook policy included compensation and employee salary information. Guess what? Same result. Employer found to have violated the National Labor Relations Act for an over-inclusive definition of confidentiality. All right, some additional examples of violations of confidentiality include do not discuss customer or employee information outside of work, including phone numbers and addresses. Well, certainly precluding employees from talking about customer information is acceptable. Labor Board can't tell you not to do that. But the inclusion of employee information, gilding the lily in our drafting, is what got the employer into trouble in that example. You must not disclose proprietary or confidential information about the employer, that's good, or other associates. So does that possibly mean that an employee cannot provide contact information for coworkers to a union representative? If it does, it violates Section 7. How about sharing of overheard conversations? That's your classic anti-gossiping provision. If you have them, delete them. It's no longer going to be found unless you're very narrow and tailored. Unless you have a policy that says employees cannot communicate on things that they knowingly believe are false. I'd eliminate them from your handbooks. Gossiping provisions will likely, if challenged, run afoul with Section 7. All right. Class collective action waivers. Another example of an employer who included way too much contractual information in their handbook. That's a separate issue. In this case, the employer included an arbitration provision in their handbook, and the arbitration provision included a class or collective waiver. Right? This is a real hot issue right now. D.R. Horton, Murphy Oil, all of these cases, the Labor Board has said that you cannot include a class or collective action waiver in any of these because an employee has a Section 7 right to engage in class activity or bring a class litigation. Now, all of your circuits that have throughout the country, circuit courts throughout the country that have opined on this issue have disagreed with the Labor Board. All of them have reached the conclusion, you know, it is not a violation of Section 7 for an employee to voluntarily sign a class or collective waiver. I put this case in here to remind you that if you do have a class action waiver in an arbitration provision or in some other type of agreement with employees, you have exposure on an administrative agency level at the Labor Board. In all likelihood, you will prevail if challenged in the circuit court, but the exposure will exist on the circuit level. So be conscious of that, right? Monitoring and recording, the Whole Foods case issued just at the end of last year. Pretty wild case from an HR perspective, has thrown us on our head a little bit. In the sense that we have all had, the Long Island employer has policies in their handbook that says recording in the workplace violates our policy. Employees should not record unless, of course, given authorization by fill in the blank. Whole Foods has basically said can't have those blanket policies anymore. In this case, Whole Foods had a policy that says, for reasons related to freedom of speech, open dialogues in the workplace, making sure people are comfortable, protection of proprietary information, for all of these reasons, we don't want employees recording conversations in the workplace. And up until Whole Foods, I didn't necessarily have a problem with that type of a policy. The Labor Board saw that policy as possibly stepping on the toes of Section 7. Remember that Lutheran Heritage definition. It's no longer a standard, it's a fishing expedition. And in this case, the Labor Board saw this or a policy against recording in the workplace, and they hooked its fish, right? Because of the fact it said, is it possible that by precluding employees from recording in the workplace, you are now saying to an employee, you cannot record other employees engaging in picketing or other strike activity? Is it possible that this policy could be drafted or interpreted in such a way that you would be precluding Section 7 activity? Labor Board said yes. So now what we need to do is look critically at our monitoring and recording policies in the workplace, and we need to be specific and as detailed as possible in terms of drafting. So a lunch and learn homework. Very simply, number one, understand Section 7. Understand what it is and understand the application of Section 7 that the Labor Board is using when interpreting your policies. And with a good understanding of that, we will then start to narrow down the broad, fluffy language that we've included in our handbooks, and we will become detailed and specific in terms of what we are really trying to preclude. I submit to the Long Island employer on this phone that if you have that fluffy language, we can maintain the concept of the language and save your policy from being a violation. All you need to do is ask yourself the question, why do I have this language? What is it that I'm trying to preclude? What is it that I'm trying to prohibit? And when you write on your piece of paper what it is that you're trying to prohibit, if it's business related, then take the rationale and take that, replace the fluffy language and put the business rationale in, put the detail in. You have now likely just saved your policy from an unfair labor practice, all right? Second bullet, use context. Put things in context. Is it unlawful to say employees cannot harass one another? Let me rephrase that. Is it a Section 7 violation to say employees cannot harass one another? This Labor Board would say, without more, yes, you cannot say employees can't harass one another, because one employee's definition of harass may be different than another's. Are you harassing me if you're asking me to sign a union authorization card? Possibly, all right? However, putting things in context are meaningful. If you say you cannot harass somebody and it's under your sexual harassment policy, now all of a sudden it has context. all right? When drafting confidentiality provisions, tailor them, look at them, spend time on them, define confidentiality, not how somebody did in Oregon when they posted their confidentiality policy on the internet, right? Look at your business, define what you mean by confidentiality, and be cognizant of class action lawsuits. I love class action waivers. I love arbitration agreements, but understand that the Labor Board is attacking them. Let's not be scared. If you have them, let's understand the risks and just tailor them accordingly. All right. Thanks for joining me for another last Friday. I hope this was informative. I certainly had a lot of fun doing it. Stay tuned for another session in May. Have a great weekend and speak to you soon.